And we're back with the time machine. Hello, everybody. If not present everybody's, then everybody's in the future when people actually are subscribed to my channel. It's the time machine, so I can make that joke. Alright, so when last we left our hero, what did happen last time we left our hero? Hold on. It's actually been a hot minute since I was recording because shenanigans. Right, so when last we left our hero, he made a friend in Weena, who is adorable. We love Weena, right? Right. And I'm sure she's not going to die tragically because she's adorable and not allowed to be an adorable female character in these older stories. Okay, yes, we met Weena and we realized that the Morlocks are a thing because, gasp, the upper class is not in control. So this is, oh gosh, Roman numerals, IX, that's 9, right? Right, that's 9. Alright, chapter 9, the Morlocks. It may seem odd to you, but it was 2 days before I could follow up the newfound clue in what was manifestly the proper way. I felt a peculiar shrinking from those pallid bodies. They were just the half-bleached color of the worms and things one sees preserved in spirit in a zoological museum, and they were filthily cold to the touch. Probably my shrinking was largely due to the sympathetic influence of the Eloi, whose disgust of the Morlocks I now began to appreciate. The next night I did not sleep well. Probably my health was a little disordered. I was oppressed with perplexity and doubt. Once or twice I had a feeling of intense fear for which I could perceive no definite reason. I remember creeping noiselessly into the great hall where the little people were sleeping in the moonlight. That night Weena was among them, and feeling reassured by their presence. It occurred to me even then that in the course of a few days the moon must pass through its last quarter, and the nights grow dark, when the appearance of these unpleasant creatures from below, these whitened lemurs, this new vermin that had replaced the old, might be more abundant. And on both these days I had the restless feeling of one who shirks an inevitable duty. I felt assured that the time machine was only to be recovered by boldly penetrating these mysteries of underground. Yet I could not face the mystery. If only I had had a companion it would have been different, but I was so horribly alone, and even to clamber down into the darkness of the well appalled me. I don't know if you will understand my feeling, but I never felt safe at my back. It was this restlessness, this insecurity, perhaps, that drove me farther and farther afield in my exploring expeditions. Going to the southwestward, towards the rising country that is now called Combe Wood, I observed far off in the direction of 19th century Bainstead a vast green structure, different in character from any I had hitherto seen. It was larger than the largest of the palaces or ruins I knew, and the facade had an oriental look, the face of it having the luster, as well as the pale green tint, a kind of bluish green of a certain type of Chinese porcelain. This difference in aspect suggested a difference in use, and I was minded to push on and explore, but the day was growing late, and I had come upon the site of the place after a long and tiring circuit, so I resolved to hold over the adventure for the following day, and I returned to the welcome and the caresses of little Weena. But next morning I perceived clearly enough that my curiosity regarding the palace of green porcelain was a piece of self-deception, to enable me to shirk, by another day, an experience I dreaded. I resolved I would make the descent without further waste of time, and started out in the early morning towards a well near the ruins of granite and aluminum. Little Weena ran with me. She danced beside me to the well, but when she saw me lean over the mouth and look downward, she seemed strangely disconcerted. "Goodbye, little Weena," I said, kissing her, and then putting her down, I began to feel over the parapet for the climbing hooks. Okay, continually, his relationship with Weena is kind of weirding me out. Like, she's caressing him, and he's kissing her, and he's calling it a flirtation, but he's still acting like she's a child, and she's also, like, I don't know. I mean, I know she's an adult of her species, but it's still gosh, it almost strikes a bestiality. I don't know if she can consent or not, you know? It's very weird. I guess what's weird is his attitude about it. Like, I don't think anyone should be romantic when they're being that kind of condescending and weird about the prospect of the person. I don't know, maybe he's not being romantic and I'm just interpreting it weird, but it's weird, right? Okay, let's see. Rather hastily, I may as well confess, for I feared my courage might leak away. At first she watched me in amazement, then she gave a most piteous cry. She began to pull at me with her little hands. I think her opposition nerved me rather to proceed. I shook her off, perhaps a little too roughly, and in another moment I was in the throat of the well. I saw her agonized face over the parapet, and smiled to reassure her. Then I had to look down at the unstable hooks to which I clung. You know, maybe you should listen to Lena since it's her time period in country. I also kind of wish that he would include the conversations he has with these guys. You know, I mean, he said that he had them, even if the sentences are like 2 words long. I had to clamber down a shaft of perhaps 200 yards. The descent was effected by means of metallic bars projecting from the sides of the wall, and these being adapted to the needs of a creature much smaller and lighter than myself, I was speedily cramped and fatigued by the descent. And not simply fatigued. One of the bars bent suddenly under my weight, and almost swung me off into the blackness beneath. For a moment I hung by one hand, and after that experience I did not dare rest again. Though my arms and back were presently acutely painful, I went on clambering down the sheer descent with as quick a motion as possible. Glancing upward, I saw the aperture, a small blue disk in which a star was visible, while little Weena's head showed as a round black projection. The thudding sound of a machine grew louder and more oppressive. Everything save that little disk above was profoundly dark, and when I looked up again, Weena had disappeared. I was in an agony of discomfort. I had some thought of trying to go up the shaft again and leave the underworld alone, but even while I turned this over in my mind, I continued to descend. At last, with intense relief, I saw dimly coming up a foot to the right of me, a slender loophole in the wall. Swinging myself in, I found it was the aperture of a narrow horizontal tunnel in which I could lie down and rest. I was not too soon. My arms ached, my back was cramped, and I was trembling with the prolonged terror of fall. Besides this, the unbroken darkness had had a distressing effect upon my eyes. The air was full of the throb and hum of machinery pumping down the shaft. I do not know how long I lay. I was aroused by a soft hand touching my face. Starting up in the darkness, I snatched at my matches, and hastily striking one, I saw 3 stooping white creatures similar to the one I had seen above the ground in the ruin, hastily retreating before the light. Living as they did, in what appeared to me impenetrable darkness, their eyes were abnormally large and sensitive, just as are the pupils of the abysmal fishes, and they reflected the light in the same way. I have no doubt they could see me in the rayless obscurity, and they did not seem to have any fear of me apart from the light. Yeah, why would they? They live without any kind of predation. They probably don't even predate on each other. But so soon as I struck a match in order to see them, they fled incontinently, vanishing into dark gutters and tunnels, from which their eyes glared at me in the strangest fashion. I tried to call to them, but the language they had was apparently different from that of the overworld people, so that I was needs left to my own unaided efforts, and the thought of flight before exploration was even then in my mind. Why is he it seems unlikely that they wouldn't know the language of the LOI. They spy on them often enough. And it's just like, why would they answer him even if they knew what he was saying? I tried to call to them, but the language they had was apparently different from that of the overworld people, so that I was needs left to my own unaided efforts, and the thought of flight before exploration was even then in my mind. But I said to myself, "You are in for it now," and feeling my way along the tunnel, I found the noise of machinery grow louder. Presently the walls fell away from me, and I came to the large open space, striking another match, saw that I had entered a vast arched cavern which stretched into utter darkness beyond the range of my light. The view I had of it was as much as one could see in the burning of a match. Necessarily, my memory was vague. Great shapes like big machines rose out of the dimness and cast grotesque black shadows in which dim spectral Morlocks sheltered from the glare. The place, by the by, was very stuffy and oppressive, and the faint halitosis of freshly shed blood was in the air. Some way down the central vista was a little table of white metal, laid with what seemed a meal. The Morlocks, at any rate, were carnivorous. Even at the time, I remembered wondering what large animal could have survived to furnish the red joint I saw. It was all very indistinct. The heavy smell, the big, unmeaning shapes, the obscene figures lurking in the shadows, and only waiting for the darkness to come at me again. Then the match burnt out, and stung my fingers and fell, a wriggling red spot in the blackness. I have thought since how particularly ill-equipped I was for such an experience. When I had started with the time machine, I had started with the absurd assumption that the men of the future would certainly be infinitely ahead of ourselves in all their appliances. I had come without arms, without medicine, without anything to smoke. Okay, actually, this is funny, because this reminds me when people are packing and they don't know what to take, and they ask me my opinion, my answer is usually, they have stores where you're going. Which is so true, and yet, in this case, so not. That advice does not work if you're traveling through time. Remember that. I had come without arms, without medicine, without anything to smoke. At times, I missed tobacco frightfully. Even without enough matches, if only I had thought of a Kodak, I could have flashed that glimpse of the underworld in a second, and examined it at leisure. But as it was, I stood there with only the weapons and the powers that nature had endowed me with, hands, feet, and teeth, those and 4 safety matches that still remained to me. I mean, yeah, nowadays you bring your cell phone, but then you wouldn't have anything to charge your cell phone in this scenario. I mean, oddly enough, one of those little disposable cameras would probably be the best thing to bring in a situation like this. Ah, that would be wild. It's almost too bad that in modern times photo doctoring is so easy to do that you can't really get wild and crazy pictures as proof anymore. I was afraid to push my way in among all this machinery in the dark, and it was only with my last glimpse of light I discovered that my store of matches had run low. It had never occurred to me until that moment that there was any need to economize them, and I had wasted almost half of the box in astonishing the overworlders to whom fire was a novelty. Now, as I say, I had 4 left, and while I stood in the dark, a hand touched me. Lank fingers came feeling over my face, and I was sensible of a peculiar, unpleasant odor. He's really lucky that the Morlocks aren't that violent. Like, nobody's body tackling him at this point. They're just like, "Ooh, man, what is it? Touch, touch, touch." No one's tried to actually hurt him. Yeah, this is, all in all, very lucky for him that the Morlocks are at least still curious. That's it, you know what, the LOI weren't that curious, but it seems that the Morlocks are. Another evidence that they're smarter than the LOI. I fancied I heard the breathing of a crowd of those dreadful little beings about me. I felt the box of matches in my hand being gently disengaged, and the other hands behind me plucking at my clothing. The sense of these unseen creatures examining me was indescribably unpleasant. The sudden realization of my ignorance of their ways of thinking and doing came home to me very vividly in the darkness. I shouted at them as loudly as I could. They started away, and then I could feel them approaching me again. They clutched at me more boldly, whispering odd sounds to each other. I shivered violently and shouted again, rather discordantly. This time they were not so seriously alarmed, and they made a queer laughing noise as they came back at me. I will confess I was horribly frightened. I determined to strike another match and escape under the protection of its glare. I did so, and eking out the flicker with a scrape of paper from my pocket, I made good my retreat to the narrow tunnel. But I had scarce entered this when my light was blown out, and in the darkness I could hear the Morlocks rustling like wind among the leaves, and pattering like the rain as they hurried after me. In a moment I was clutched by several hands, and there was no mistaking that they were trying to haul me back. I struck another light and waved it in their dazzled faces. You can scarce imagine how nauseatingly inhuman they looked, those pale, chinless faces and great, lidless, pinkish gray eyes, as they started in their blindness and bewilderment. But I did not stay to look, I promise you. I retreated again, and when my second match had ended, I struck my third. I had almost burnt through when I reached the opening in the shaft. I lay down on the edge, for the throb of the great pump below made me giddy. Then I felt sideways for the projecting hooks, and, as I did so, my feet were grasped from behind, and I was violently tugged backward. I lit my last match, and it incontinently went out, but I had my hand on the climbing bars now, and, kicking violently, I disengaged myself from the clutches of the Morlocks, and was speedily clambering up the shaft, while they stayed peering and blinking up at me, all but one little wretch who followed me for some time, and well-nigh secured my boot as a trophy. Wow, okay, that whole scene just kind of makes me wonder if anyone's written fanfic about this. I mean, you know what I mean, right? Yeah. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. If you don't know what I mean, I'm not going to elaborate. That climb seemed interminable to me. With the last 20 or 30 feet of it, a deadly nausea came upon me. I had the greatest difficulty in keeping my hold. The last few yards was a frightful struggle against this faintness. Several times my head swam, and I felt all the sensations of falling. At last, however, I got over the well-mouth somehow, and staggered out of the ruin into the blinding sunlight. I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelt sweet and clean. Then I remember Weena kissing my hands and ears, and the voices of others among the Eloi. Then, for a time, I was insensible. Whew, okay, that is the end of Chapter 9. I finally got a look at the Morlocks. Okay, tea break time. Oh no, it's getting overbrewed. No! I've got a ginger turmeric green tea that I'm trying today that actually got sent to me as a mistake. I had ordered ginger peach tea and I got this instead, which is very different. It's not bad. It's more earthy than sweet. I tend to like sweet teas. But, sometimes earthy is satisfying. How about those Morlocks? I'm not sure what he was hoping to accomplish with that. I guess knowing more about the situation. Yeah, alright, knowing more about the situation. It's not like he could do anything else. Still, he's a great inventor. Right? He's an inventor. He had matches. I don't understand why he hasn't been using this time to build tools to get through the panels on the doors. Maybe the panels on the doors are too tough for him to do anything rudimentary, but I don't know, I feel like he could have been looking for some iron scrap and melting it down at some point. I mean, I guess if you're a modern person, you don't necessarily know how to do rustic homestead stuff. I don't know. It feels like he could have come up with a tool rather than go and get himself captured by a bunch of handsy Morlocks. Yeah, this is good tea. Oh, I should put honey in it. That would actually probably be better for my throat doing all this reading. Oh well. Okay, on to Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is called When Night Came. Now, indeed, I seemed in a worse case than before. Hitherto, except during my night's anguish at the loss of the time machine, I had felt a sustaining hope of ultimate escape. But that hope was staggered by these new discoveries. Hitherto? Did you really just use hitherto twice? Did you just... Really? Okay. I feel like hitherto is one of those words that you need to be careful with, but you really just used it twice in a row. Hitherto, I had merely thought myself impeded by the childish simplicity of the little people, and by some unknown forces which I had only to understand to overcome. But there was an altogether new element in the sickening quality of the Morlocks, a something inhuman and malign. Instinctively I loathed them. Before, I had felt as a man might feel who had fallen into a pit. My concern was with the pit, and how to get out of it. Now I felt like a beast in a trap, whose enemy would come upon him soon. The enemy I dreaded may surprise you. It was the darkness of the new moon. Weena had put this into my head by some of the first incomprehensible remarks about the dark nights. It was not now such a very difficult problem to guess what the coming dark nights might mean. Okay, yeah, see, the LOI are smart enough to be able to keep track of the light and to have a word. Like, I really would like to hear this conversation between him and Weena about the dark nights. I do really like this book, but it's definitely telling, not showing, which is too bad. I'd like I'd like a more definite example of Weena's character, for instance. The moon was on the wane. Each night there was a longer interval of darkness, and I now understood, in some slight degree at least, the reason of the fear of the little upper-world people for the dark. I wondered vaguely what foul villainy it might be that the Morlocks did under the new moon. I felt pretty sure now that my second hypothesis was all wrong. The upper-world people might once have been the favorite aristocracy, and the Morlocks their mechanical servants, but that had long since passed away. The two species that had resulted from the evolution of man were sliding down towards, or had already arrived at, an altogether new relationship. The Eloi, like the Carlovagian kings, had decayed to a mere beautiful futility. They still possessed the earth on sufferance, since the Morlocks, subterranean for innumerable generations, had come at last to find the daylight surface intolerable, and the Morlocks made their garments, I inferred, and maintained them in their habitual needs, perhaps through the survival of an old habit of service. They did it as a standing horse paws with his foot, or as a man enjoys killing animals in sport, because ancient and departed necessities had impressed it on the organism. This bitch did not just say, did you hear that? This bitch did not just say that working class people have the urge to knit ingrained in their person. Can you just imagine a Morlock sitting in the dark, knitting incessantly at a little scarf, the way a caterpillar spins a cocoon? What are you doing, Frank? I have no idea, but I feel an urge to do it. What are you gonna do with it when you're done? I don't know. Should we just throw it away? Oh, it's just the fact that I realized that you were trying to, like, hold the suspicion off for the dramatic reveal, but just that some of the mistakes that this guy makes. At least he makes mistakes, I suppose. Okay, enough laughing at Morlocks being crafty. But clearly the old order was already in part reversed. The nemesis of the delicate ones was creeping on apace. Ages ago, thousands of generations ago, man had thrust his brother man out of the ease and the sunshine, and now that brother was coming back. Changed. Already the Eloi had begun to learn one old lesson anew. They were becoming reacquainted with fear. And suddenly there came into my head the memory of the meat I had seen in the underworld. It seemed odd how it floated into my mind, not stirred up, as it were, by the current of my meditations, but coming in almost like a question from the outside. I tried to recall the form of it. I had a vague sense of something familiar, but I could not tell what it was at the time. Still, however helpless the little people in the presence of their mysterious fear, I was differently constituted. I came out of this age of ours, this ripe prime of the human race, when fear does not paralyze and mystery has lost its terrors. I, at least, would defend myself. Without further delay, I determined to make myself arms and a fastness where I might sleep. With that refuge as a base, I could face this strange world with some of that confidence I had lost in realizing to what creatures, night by night, I lay exposed. Oh, so you're not going to build a tool to break open the door, but you're going to build a tool to kill somebody who decides to poke you when you're sleeping? I felt I could never sleep again until my bed was secure from them. I shuddered with horror to think how they must already have examined me. Oh gosh, is there fanfic? Please tell me there's fanfic. I wandered during the afternoon along the valley of the Thames. but found nothing that commended itself to my mind as inaccessible. All the buildings and trees seemed easily practicable to such dexterous climbers as the Morlocks, to judge by their wells, must be. Then the tall pinnacles of the palace of the green porcelain and the polished gleam of its walls came back to my memory, and in the evening, taking Weena like a child upon my shoulder, I went up the hills towards the southwest. The distance, I had reckoned, was 7 or 8 miles, but it must have been nearer 18. I had first seen the place on a moist afternoon when distances are deceptively diminished. In addition, the heel of one of my shoes was loose, and a nail was working through the sole. They were comfortable old shoes I wore about indoors, not that I was lame, and it was already long past sunset when I came in sight of the palace, silhouetted black against the pale yellow of the sky. Weena had been hugely delighted when I began to carry her, but after a while she desired me to let her down, and ran along by the side of me, occasionally darting off on either hand to pick flowers to stick in my pockets. My pockets had always puzzled Weena, but at the last she had concluded that they were an eccentric kind of vases for floral decoration. At least she utilized them for that purpose. And that reminds me, in changing my jacket I found... The time-traveler paused, put his hand into his pocket, and silently placed 2 withered flowers, not unlike very large white mallows, upon the little table. Then he resumed his narrative. As the hush of evening crept over the world, and we proceeded over the hill crest towards Wimbledon, Weena grew tired and wanted to return to the house of grey stone. But I pointed out the distant pinnacles of the palace of green porcelain to her, and contrived to make her understand that we were seeking a refuge there from her fear. You know that great pause that comes upon things before the dusk? Even the breeze stops in the trees. To me there is always an air of expectation about that evening stillness. The sky was clear, remote, and empty save for a few horizontal bars, far down in the sunset. Well, that night the expectation took the color of my fears. In that darkening calm my senses seemed preternaturally sharpened. I fancied I could even feel the hollowness of the ground beneath my feet, could, indeed, almost see through it, the Morlocks on their ant-hill going hither and thither, and waiting for the dark. In my excitement, I fancied that they would receive my invasion of their burrows as a declaration of war. And why had they taken my time machine? You know, it said he started walking, late in the afternoon. Why not? Gosh, he makes so many bad decisions. If he'd started earlier, he could fortify a base. And now it's dark. Assumptions. So we went on in the quiet, and the twilight deepened into night. The clear blue of the distance faded, and one star after another came out. The ground grew dim and the trees black. Weena's fears and her fatigue grew upon her. I took her in my arms and talked to her and caressed her. Then, as the darkness grew deeper, she put her arms round my neck, and closing her eyes, tightly pressed her face against my shoulder. So we went down a long slope into a valley, and there in the dimness I almost walked into a little river. This I waded, and went up the opposite side of the valley, past a number of sleeping houses, and by a statue, a faun, or some such figure, minus the head. Here, too, were acacias. So far I had seen nothing of the Morlocks, but it was yet early in the night, and the darker hours before the old moon rose were still to come. From the brow of the next hill I saw a thick woods spreading wide and black before me. I hesitated at this. I could see no end to it, either to the right or left. Feeling tired, my feet in particular were very sore, I carefully lowered Weena from my shoulder as I halted, and sat down upon the turf. I could no longer see the palace of green porcelain, and was in doubt of my direction. I looked into the thickness of the wood, and thought of what it might hide. Under that dense tangle of branches, one would be out of sight of the stars. Even were there no other lurking danger, a danger I did not care to let my imagination loose upon, there would still be all the roots to stumble over, and the tree boles to strike against. I was very tired, too, after the excitements of the day, so I decided that I would not face it, but would pass the night upon the open hill. So many bad decisions. Poor Weena. Weena, I was glad to find, was fast asleep. I carefully wrapped her in my jacket and sat down beside her to wait for the moonrise. The hillside was quiet and deserted, but from the black of the wood there came now and then a stir of living things. Above me shone the stars, The night was very clear. I felt a certain sense of friendly comfort in their twinkling. All of the old constellations had gone from the sky, however. That slow movement which is imperceptible to 100 human lifetimes had long since rearranged them in unfamiliar groupings. But the Milky Way, it seemed to me, was still the same tattered streamer of stardust as of yore. Oh, that's a beautiful way to describe the Milky Way. I like that. Southward, as I judged it, was a very bright red star that was new to me. It was even more splendid than our own green Sirius, and amid all these scintillating points of light, one bright planet shone kindly and steadily like the face of an old friend. Looking at these stars suddenly dwarfed my own troubles and all the gravities of terrestrial life. I thought of their unfathomable distance and the slow, inevitable drift of their movements out of the unknown past into the unknown future. I thought of the great precessional cycle that the whole of the earth describes. Only 40 times had that silent revolution occurred during all the years that I had traversed, and during those few revolutions all the activity, all the tradition, the complex organizations, the nations, languages, literatures, aspirations, even the mere memory of man as I knew him, had been swept out of existence. Instead were these frail creatures who had forgotten their high ancestry, and the white things of which I went in terror. Ah, yes, in the future as in now, white man is a terror. Then I thought of the great fear that was between the two species, and for the first time, with a sudden shiver, came the clear knowledge of what the meat I had seen might be. Yet it was too horrible. I looked at little Weena sleeping beside me, her face white and star-like under the stars, and forthwith dismissed the thought. Through that long night I held my mind off the Morlocks as well as I could, and whiled away the time by trying to fancy I could find signs of the old constellations in the new confusion. The sky kept very clear, except for a hazy cloud or so. No doubt I dozed at times. Then, as my vigil wore on, came a faintness in the eastward sky, like the reflection of some colourless fire, and the old moon rose, thin and peaked and white. And close behind and overtaking it and overflowing it, the dawn came, pale at first, and then growing pink and warm. No Morlocks had approached us. Oh, he does make it through the night. Cool. Indeed, I had seen none upon the hill that night, and in the confidence of renewed day it almost seemed to me my fear had been unreasonable. I stood up and found my foot with the loose heel swollen at the ankle and painful under the heel, so I sat down again, took off my shoes, and flung them away. I awakened Weena, and we went down into the woods, now green and pleasant instead of black and forbidding. We found some fruit wherewith to break our fast. We soon met others of the dainty ones, laughing and dancing in the sunlight as though there was no such thing in nature as the night, and then I thought once more of the meat that I had seen. I felt assured now of what it was, and from the bottom of my heart I pitied this last feeble rill from the great flood of humanity. Clearly at some time in the long ago of human decay the Morlocks' food had run short. Possibly they had lived on rats and such like vermin. Even now is man far less discriminating and exclusive in his food than he was, far less than any monkey. His prejudice against human flesh is no deep-seated instinct, and so these inhuman sons of men. I tried to look at the thing in a scientific spirit. After all, they were less human and more remote than our cannibal ancestors of 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and the intelligence that would have made this state of things a torment had gone. Why should I trouble myself? These LOI were mere fatted cattle, which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon, probably saw to the breeding of. And there was Weena dancing at my side. Okay, he said it. He said that the Morlocks breed the LOI. I didn't say it. Also, I feel like here, in fact, is an eat-the-rich joke, considering that that is exactly what the Morlocks have done. Then I tried to preserve myself from the horror that was coming upon me by regarding it as a rigorous punishment of human selfishness. Man had been content to live in ease and delight upon the labors of his fellow man, had taken necessity as his watchword and excuse, and in the fullness of time necessity had come home to him. I even tried to Carlyle-like scorn of these wretched aristocracy in decay. But this attitude of mind was impossible. However great their intellectual degradation, the LOI had kept too much of the human form not to claim my sympathy, and to make me perforce a sharer in their degradation and their fear. I had, at that time, very vague ideas as to the course I should pursue. My first was to secure some safe place of refuge, and to make myself such arms of metal or stone as I could contrive. That necessity was immediate. In the next place, I hoped to procure some means of fire, so that I should have the weapon of a torch at hand, for nothing, I knew, would be more efficient against these Morlocks. Then I wanted to arrange some contrivance to break open the doors of bronze under the white sphinx. Oh, okay, good. He is planning on doing that. I guess it's fair that he didn't have the right materials where he landed. I had in mind a battering ram. Okay, I had in mind a hammer and chisel, dude. Never mind. What a dork. I had a persuasion that if I could enter those doors and carry a blaze of light before me, I should discover the time machine and escape. I could not imagine the Morlocks were strong enough to move it far away. Weena I had resolved to bring with me for our own time, and Wait, what are you going to do with Weena? What are you going to do with Weena during our own time? Are you going to keep her as a pet? No one is going to... How is that? What are you going to do with Weena in your own time? Okay, he definitely has weird feelings for Weena, and I don't know how to respond to that, dude. Other than wonder again about fan fiction, which I really need to stop bringing up. And turning such schemes over in my mind, I pursued our way towards the building which my fancy had chosen as our dwelling. Yeah, you are way obsessed with that pyramid of porcelain, my man. Okay, it is tea break time. Because that's the end of the chapter. Oh, hello. It is also princess time, apparently. Hi, princess. Yes, I'm going to make you sit in my lap because I love you. Oh, you like it. You like the head rubs. So lovely. Alright, princess, are you ready? Are you ready for chapter 11? I'm ready for chapter 11. Let's go. I had found the palace of green porcelain when we approached it about noon, deserted and falling into ruin. Only ragged vestiges of glass remained in its windows. I'm surprised that's even there, wow. And great sheets of the green facing had fallen away from the corroded metallic framework. It lay very high upon a turfy down, and looking northeastward before I entered it, I was surprised to see a large estuary, or even creek, where I judged Wainsworth and Batters must once have been. I thought then, though I never followed up the thought, of what might have happened, or might be happening, to the living things in the sea. The material of the palace proved, on examination, to be indeed porcelain, and along the face of it I saw an inscription of some unknown character. I thought, rather foolishly, that Weena might help me to interpret this, but I only learnt that the bare idea of writing had never entered her head. She always seemed to me, I fancy, more human than she was, perhaps because her affection was so human. I mean, writing doesn't necessarily mean they're human. We had humans way before we had writing. Within the big valves of the door, which were open and broken, we found instead the customary hall, a long gallery lit by Princess. Okay, you're on my desk and you're standing right in front of the screen, baby. I can't read about the porcelain palace when you want to stand in front of it. Come here. Within the big valves of the door, which were open and broken, we found, instead of the customary hall, a long gallery lit by many side windows. At the first glance I was reminded of a museum. The tiled floor was thick with dust, and a remarkable array of miscellaneous objects was shrouded in the same grey covering. Then I perceived, standing strange and gaunt in the centre of the hall, what was clearly the lower part of a huge skeleton. I recognized the oblique feet that it was some extinct creature after the fashion of the Megatherium. The skull and the upper bones lay beside it in the thick dust, and in one place, where rainwater had dropped through a leak in the roof, the thing itself had been worn away. Further in the gallery was the huge skeleton barrel of a brontosaurus. My museum hypothesis was confirmed. Going towards the side, I found what appeared to be sloping shelves, and clearing away the thick dust, I found the old familiar glass cases of our own time. but they must have been airtight to judge from the fair preservation of some of their contents. Clearly we stood among the ruins of some later-day South Kensington. Here, apparently, was the paleontological section, and a very splendid array of fossils it must have been, though the inevitable process of decay that had been staved off for a time, and had, through the extinction of bacteria and fungi, lost 99/100ths of its force. Oh God, the extinction of bacteria and fungi would be so bad. Oh, that would be such a bad thing to happen. That can't have happened. The world would not look the way it did if that had happened. Can you imagine? There would be dead things everywhere. There's also not even bugs to eat the dead things. No, this time person does not understand how important our corpse eaters are. Anyways, lost 99/100ths of its force was nevertheless, with extreme sureness, if with extreme slowness, at work again upon all its treasures. Here and there I found traces of the little people in the shape of rare fossils broken to pieces or threaded in strings upon reeds. Oh, that's kind of adorable, though, all these childlike beings going about and wrecking everything. Oh, you wanna go, princess? Bye. And the cases had in some instances been bodily removed, by the Morlocks, I judged. The place was very silent. The thick dust deadened our footsteps. Weena, who had been rolling a sea urchin down the sloping glass of a case, presently came as I stared about me, and very quietly took my hand and stood beside me. As creepy as he is about Weena, she loves him so much. And at first I was so much surprised by this ancient monument of an intellectual age that I gave no thought to the possibilities it presented. Even my preoccupation about the time machine receded a little from my mind. To judge from the size of the place, this palace of green porcelain had a great deal more in it than a gallery of paleontology, possibly historical galleries. It might be even a library. To me, at least, in my present circumstances, this would be vastly more interesting than the spectacle of old-time geology and decay. Exploring, I found another short gallery, running transversely to the first. This appeared to be devoted to minerals, and the sight of a block of sulfur set my mind running on gunpowder. But I could find no saltpeter, indeed no nitrates of any kind. Okay, he knows how to make gunpowder, but he doesn't know how to make a hammer and chisel. I'm just saying. Doubtless they had deliquesced ages ago, yet the sulfur hung in my mind, and set up a train of thinking. As for the rest of the contents of that gallery, though on the whole they were the best preserved of all I saw, I had little interest. I am no specialist in mineralogy, and I went on down the very ruinous aisle, running parallel to the first hall I had entered. Apparently this section had been devoted to natural history, but everything had long since passed out of recognition. A few shriveled and blackened vestiges of what had once been stuffed animals, desiccated mummies and jars that had once held spirit, a brown dust of departed plants. That was all. I was sorry for that, because I should have been glad to trace the patent readjustments by which the conquest of animated nature had been attained. Then we came to a gallery of simply colossal proportions, but singularly ill-lit, the floor of it running downward at a slight angle from the end at which I entered. At intervals, white globes hung from the ceiling, many of them cracked and smashed, which suggested that originally the place had been artificially lit. Here I was more in my element, for rising on either side of me were huge bulks of big machines, all greatly corroded and many broken down, but some still fairly complete. You know I have a certain weakness for mechanisms. Yeah, no shit. Though oddly enough, I say, this museum probably had a lot of computers and touring computers, but I don't think it would be anything that you recognized. Maybe even built into the walls, holographic tour guides. That would be cool. And I was inclined to linger among these, the more so, for the most part they had the interest of puzzles, and I could make only the vaguest guesses at what they were for. I fancied that if I could solve their puzzles, I should find myself in possession of powers that might be of use against the Morlocks. Actually, that would be cool, like a puzzle game in kind of the style of Myst, except this story. That would be cool, right? I'd play that. That sounds amazing. Suddenly, Weena came very close to my side. So suddenly that she startled me. Had it not been for her, I do not think I should have noticed that the floor of the gallery sloped at all. Footnote. It may be, of course, that the floor did not slope, but that the museum was built into the side of the hill. E.D. Why is there a random footnote from the editor in the middle of his story? That's very jarring. The end that I had come in at was above ground, and was lit by rare slit-like windows. As you went down the length, the ground came up against these windows, until at last there was a pit like the area of a London house before each, and only a narrow line of daylight at the top. I went slowly along, puzzling about the machines, and had been too intent upon them to notice the gradual diminution of the light, until Weena's increasing apprehensions drew my attention. Then I saw that the gallery ran down at last into a thick darkness. I hesitated, and then as I looked round me, I saw that the dust was less abundant, and its surface less... What? What? I thought you didn't want to be up here. Princess, you are having so much time in this story. She stood up and caught at my arm. Okay, well, you can be in my lap, or you can be down there. Really trash. Do you want up? Do you want out? I'll let you out. Be right back then. I hesitated, and then as I looked round me, I saw that the dust was less abundant, and its surface less even. Further away, towards the dimness, it appeared to be broken by a number of small, narrow footprints. My sense of the immediate presence of the Morlocks revived at that. I felt that I was wasting my time in the academic examination of machinery. I called to mind that it was already far advanced in the afternoon, and that I had still no weapon, no refuge, and no means of making a fire. And then, down in the remote blackness of the gallery, I heard a peculiar pattering, and the same odd noises I had heard down the well. I took Weena's hand. Then, struck with a sudden idea, I left her and turned to a machine from which projected a lever, not unlike those in a signal box. Clambering upon the stand and grasping this lever in my hands, I put all my weight upon it sideways. Suddenly Weena, deserted in the central aisle, began to whimper. I had judged the strength of the lever pretty correctly, for it snapped after a minute's strain, and I rejoined her with a mace in my hand, more than sufficient, I judged, for any Morlock's skull I might encounter. And I longed very much to kill a Morlock or so. Very inhuman, you may think, to want to go killing one's own descendants, but it was impossible somehow to feel any humanity in the things. Only my disinclination to leave Weena, and a persuasion that if I began to slake my thirst for murder my time machine might suffer, restrained me from going straight down the gallery and killing the brutes I heard. Well, mace in one hand and Weena in the other, I went out of that gallery and into another still larger one, which at first glance reminded me of a military chapel hung with tattered flags. The brown and charred rags that hung from the sides of it I presently recognized as the decaying vestiges of books. They had long since dropped to pieces, and every semblance of print had left them. But here there were warped boards and cracked metallic clasps that told the tale well enough. Had I been a literary man, I might, perhaps, have moralized upon the futility of all ambition. But as it was, the thing struck me with keenest force was the enormous waste of labor to which this sombre wilderness of rotting paper testified. At the time, I will confess, I thought chiefly of the philosophical transactions and my own 17 papers upon physical optics. Then, going up a broad staircase, we came to what may once have been a gallery of technical chemistry. And here I had not a little hope of useful discoveries. Except at one end where the roof had collapsed, this gallery was well preserved. I went eagerly to every unbroken case, and at last, in one of the really airtight cases, I found a box of matches. Very eagerly I tried them. They were perfectly good. They were not even damp. I turned to Weena. "Dance!" I cried to her in her own tongue, for now I had a weapon indeed against the horrible creatures we feared. And so, in that derelict museum, upon the soft carpet of dust, to Weena's huge delight, I solemnly performed a kind of composite dance, whistling the Land of the Leal as cheerfully as I could. In part it was a modest can-can, in part a step dance, in part a skirt dance, so far as my tailcoat permitted, and in part original, for I am naturally inventive, as you know. What a weird sentiment for... I'm naturally invented. I strung together a bunch of random dances and danced like a toddler. I do appreciate how, human and silly and affable this guy is, even if he's a bit of a dork and makes bad decisions. Now I still think that for this box of matches to have escaped the wear of for immemorial years was a most strange, as for me it was a most fortunate thing. Yet, oddly enough, I found a far unlikelier substance, and that was camphor. I found it in a sealed jar that by chance, I suppose, had been really hermetically sealed. I fancied at first that it was paraffin wax, and smashed the glass accordingly, but the odor of camphor was unmistakable. In the universal decay this volatile substance had chanced to survive, perhaps through many thousands of centuries. It reminded me of a sepia painting I had once seen done from the ink of a fossil belemnite that must have perished and become fossilized millions of years ago. I was about to throw it away, but I remembered that it was inflammable and burnt with a good bright flame. Was, in fact, an excellent candle, and I put it in my pocket. I found no explosives, however, nor any means of breaking down the bronze doors, and yet my iron crowbar was the most helpful thing I had chanced upon. Nevertheless, I left that gallery greatly elated. I cannot tell you all the story of that long afternoon. It would require a great effort of memory to recall my explorations in at all the proper order. I remember a long gallery of resting stands of arms, and how I hesitated between my crowbar and a hatchet or a sword. I could not carry both. However, you mean none of those things had like a belt or anything with them? Or a chain? I could not carry both, however, and my bar of iron promised best against the bronze skates. There were numbers of guns, pistols, and rifles. The most were masses of rust, but many were of some new metal and still fairly sound. But any cartridges or powder there may once have been had rotted into dust. One corner I saw was charred and shattered, perhaps, I thought, by an explosion among the specimens. In another place was a vast array of idols, Polynesian, Mexican, Grecian, Phoenician, every country on earth, I should think. And here, yielding to an irresistible impulse, I wrote my name upon the nose of a stetite monster from South America that particularly took my fancy. Humans got a human. Write their name on absolutely everything. Also, he's teasing us. He wrote his name and we still don't know what it is. As the evening drew on, my interest waned. I went through gallery after gallery, dusty, silent, often ruinous, the exhibits sometimes mere heaps of rust and lignite, sometimes fresher. In one place, I suddenly found myself near the model of a tin mine, and then, by the merest accident, I discovered, in an airtight case, 2 dynamite cartridges. I shouted "Eureka!" and smashed the case with joy. Then came a doubt. I hesitated. Then, selecting a little side gallery, I made my essay. I never felt such disappointment as I did in waiting 5, 10, 15 minutes for an explosion that never came. Of course the things were dummies. I might have guessed from their presence. I really believe that had they not been so, I should have rushed off incontinually and blown the Sphinx bronze doors, and, as it proved, my chances of finding the time machine altogether into non-existence. It was after that, I think, that we came to a little open court within the palace. It was turfed, and had 3 fruit trees, so we rested and refreshed ourselves. Towards sunset I began to consider our position. Night was creeping upon us, and my inaccessible hiding-place had still to be found. But that troubled me very little now. I had in my possession a thing that was, perhaps, the best of all defenses against the Morlocks. I had matches. I had the camphor in my pocket, too, if a blaze were needed. It seemed to me that the best thing we could do would be to pass the night in the open, protected by a fire. In the morning there was the getting of the time machine. Towards that, as yet, I had only my iron mace. But now, with my growing knowledge, I felt very differently towards those bronze doors. Up to this, I had refrained from forcing them, largely because of the mystery on the other side. They had never impressed me as being very strong, and I hoped to find my bar of iron not altogether inadequate for the work. Okay, we are going to stop it there. We are armed, we have fire, we have yet to solve the mystery of what his relationship with Weena is. Who am I kidding? It's just creepy. And we are continually making bad decisions, as it should be. Next time, I think we are probably going to finish it up, because we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4-ish chapters left, and some of them look short. So yeah, I think we are going to finish it next time. Very exciting! Alright, everybody, until that next time, bye!